Our first look at NFL team odds to win the division. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. First off, apology for our inconsistent recording schedule. We've had a lot going on this spring. Both Shawn and I think, Shawn, you mentioned, I don't want to give away too much of your stuff, but I think you mentioned on the show that you're moving right now. I've been working a ton on trying to get back in shape, finishing up a pretty rigorous 3-month workout program that's been a success, and starting to coach my daughter in softball. And so anyway, we have a bunch of stuff going on in our personal lives that has been taking a little bit of precedent. We're excited about that. I know you guys are for us. Secondly, the intro or the title I just said for this topic, I'm sure a lot of people are like, well, this isn't a betting show. What are we talking about here? We have said for a lot of years on the show that we think the team success stuff is probably not discussed as much as it should be, as people hyper-focus on players and like player profiles. This is something we've done for the last few years in the offseason, is talk a little bit about where we think teams are at, where teams are from like a organization standpoint, from a health standpoint, whether they're going to be good or bad, whether they're going to be good or bad relative to expectations in the coming season, as a means for understanding where there might be value that is not being captured in ADP and in the fantasy football marketplace. So don't get it wrong. This is very much a fantasy football discussion, as we both, something Shawn and I have talked about a ton, both on the show and off the show, agree is a really key part of our process in terms of figuring out what we think are the situations that we want to target, where there might be value, et cetera. It's really hard to find value in the situations that just kind of suck, where like the coaches or the team or everything is just not going well. That's a huge story for football in general as a sport, and in terms of how you play fantasy. So for us, I just want to be clear, there's going to be no like strong betting advice on this show. We are looking at these lines for the first time. I just typed them into a document like 10 minutes ago. We did a whole, Shawn and I, catching up talk for like an hour plus, almost 2 hours just now, and didn't talk about this at all until literally 10 minutes ago. Just typed over the odds. We're looking through it. We're making some quick first notes. Shawn, you had the great idea that we'll do a kind of a first look show here, give our first ideas. We'll maybe check back in a few weeks right before the draft, and after we've had some time to sit on it, maybe do a little bit more research on it. A big part of what we may not understand as well as the market, frankly, could be stuff like defensive, outlooks and depth at different positions, and maybe offensive line related stuff, things like that. We're heavily focused on offense and skill positions and those types of things. And then maybe we'll do a third look, depending on, how things work, after the draft and after teams have pretty much settled in for their whole off seasons. But it seems like right now, I mean, the big stuff that's happened so far is really free agency. We've seen a lot of player movement. And the best way to, I think, talk about that is to try to hit on it from the team level and say, these are the teams that we feel like have gotten better or gotten worse. And so anyway, that's what we're going to do. But how you doing?
Good. It, as you mentioned, it's been fun to take a global perspective on some of the things that we're doing. I enjoyed that chat. We have all kinds of fun stuff we are doing with fantasy football. But then mostly right now, as we wait for the NFL draft to be the next big piece, we have a chance to sit back and look a little more globally at the teams, at the players. Sometimes it actually just makes some sense to get a little bit of distance. If you do fantasy football, and I mean this from an analyst perspective, from a drafter perspective, if you are drafting every single day of the year when drafts are out there, you probably aren't going to need or get the distance that you need when it comes to rectifying mistakes, fixing holes that you have in either your analysis or your view of certain players. So I would encourage everyone to do that. But also, I think it makes sense to do exercises like this where maybe it's more of an intuitive look at where things are, and then you jump into even more of the details. Now, having said that, I've gone through and looked at the draft pieces that these teams have. And one of the things that really jumped out to me, Ben, that seemed kind of crazy, is that to this point, and we still could obviously have quite a few trades, but right now everyone has their first round pick. I don't know how to necessarily check that for previous years, but my sense is that this is pretty unique, right? That we don't have a bunch of teams that traded their first round picks in previous seasons in order to get up, make some moves, traded them for pieces like a Tyreek Hill, what have you, that everybody at this point still has their picks. And it does seem like we're moving in the direction where the Titans will take far and away the best QB in the draft at number 1, which might create a dynamic where we see fewer of those trades. One of the things that happened last year, and the reason that all the teams have their picks is it never quite meshed for a team to move up and or the team that got the offers. Like last year, for example, we know that the Vikings were willing to offer quite a bit to the Patriots to move up and take Drake May, but the Patriots turned that down. When you had all of those QBs that went early in last year's draft, and everybody was more or less, other than the Raiders, were able to get somebody and get probably their guy. The one team that seemed like they maybe didn't was the Vikings, and we don't know what the answer to that is yet because J.J. McCarthy got hurt. But all the way down to the Broncos, who seemed like they were very, very high on Bo Nix, and then that more or less came to fruition. The teams had shots at QBs. They didn't make the move up. People got who they wanted. And now we're in this environment where the other thing that stood out, it's not that all the teams are the same. There are a few teams, like, for example, the Minnesota Vikings don't have a lot of picks, but they still basically have their early picks. And so depending on how you look at that, they'll be fine. There aren't a lot of teams either, and this kind of builds off that same basic dynamic. There aren't a lot of teams that just have an extraordinary amount of draft capital going into this year. So if you want to mildly ignore what the teams have in terms of draft picks as you're looking at teams right now, you can do that a little bit more than maybe you were able to many years in the past.
It's fascinating. And as you were saying that and not knowing how far I went back, I did a quick little Google here. Shout out Witness Gritness on Reddit, who had a post that said that every team has their first round pick. This is a couple months ago that they wrote this, but you're saying that's still true. I haven't seen any major first round picks being dealt from the 2025 draft. If every team drafts a player, it'll be the first time in the 32 team NFL era since 2002 that every team used a first round pick. It doesn't say how far back that goes, but they seem to have done the legwork to look back to when we went to 32 teams, when the Texans became a team in 2002, that this has never happened. So it's kind of fascinating. And a lot of people in the Reddit that are saying it's probably not going to stay this way. People are going to trade out, whatever. But it's not just draft day trades that happen. It doesn't usually happen to this point in March. This is pretty shocking. But yeah, maybe even if we get to like pick 25, you still see those trades. Like last year we saw, what did we see? The Bills trade back with the Chiefs, and they got back to 32, and then they traded back again with the Panthers for the Panthers to come up and take Leggett with the last pick in the first round, and they went back and they ended up taking Keon Coleman in the very early part of the second round. We sometimes see those picks where teams like to trade into the very last picks of the first round because they can then get a fifth-year option on the player. There's some contractual stuff there. It wouldn't be a surprise, essentially, even if we got through 29 teams sticking to this trend that we didn't get through all 32. But it is fascinating. And to your point also about there's not a lot of teams that have like massive draft capital. We've talked about this a lot this offseason. And you were talking on a recent show about like kind of need a super team these days. It's hard to acquire talent as well. It has been difficult, I think, in free agency this year. We saw a lot of teams re-sign internal talent even at the 11th hour, because it started to become clear, I think, to teams when you start to get to that non-legal, legal tampering period, whatever, like right before the actual legal tampering period, that that there was a lot of competition for the actual free agents that were desirable, that were going to hit the market because their teams couldn't retain them. Everyone that I saw talk about free agency said it's not a deep free agency. There were some players. There are always going to be some that teams can't retain as much as they would like to, or just are moving on from for whatever reason. But as we talked about, a lot of cap space around the league. The cap has risen at a really high rate, more so than I think teams expected, more so than contracts have really been able to catch up with. That's why every new quarterback contract's the biggest of all time. And every non-quarterback contract becomes the biggest non-quarterback contract of all time, it seems. And because there's also other elements of it, like the T. Higgins contract, for example. A lot of people said, man, that's a really light contract for him. He gave like a really like a big hometown discount relative to maybe what he could have gotten. But I think from his perspective, it's also like, well, 2 years ago, I didn't think I was going to get this when I first got franchise tagged. It's like everything's growing so quickly that there's also these players that are almost willing to take a little bit of a discount to stay at home, discount relative to what they could really do if they were trying to maximize, but not necessarily a discount relative to what they were expecting when they were looking ahead to free agency 2 years ago. It's still more than what their target was 2 years ago, because things have just what happens when everything escalates. So the pie has gotten bigger and people are, I think, more content now. And then it makes it easier for players. I mean, I'm not saying that any player should be prioritizing the team over their own earning power, but I think it does make it easier for players to be like, well, I do want to play with the people that I care about and I'm well taken care of and whatever. I mean, I'm not saying that was T. Higgins' calculus, but it did seem like he wanted to stay with Joe Burrow and with Jamar Chase, and that trio was all very into, let's keep this trio together. There's a lot of comments that came out from different parts of that group. It seems like that had a significant effect. Big for Bengals fans. And they were also, Trey Hendrickson asked for a trade. They were looking to trade him. They weren't going to get the draft capital they wanted. I think they wanted a first maybe. And so it's like teams aren't necessarily willing to give that up because then they know they have to give him a huge contract. But now the Bengals were able to make some contract stuff work. It sounds like they were going to be able to potentially extend Hendrickson as well, which originally it was like, we're not going to be able to keep all of these guys. I think the cap is leaning into that, what you were talking about, that lack of movement of the picks. You don't have to trade away to make things work when you have more flexibility within the cap. The constraints haven't been as demanding on the teams, I guess, overall. I'm trying to tie this all together. I do think the cap rising has a significant impact on why we haven't seen as many picks traded. I don't know that I have the explanation.
Well, the thing that comes out from what you're saying, though, is that it's also the case that if you don't have a super team, it's going to be probably, it's not like one stroke of genius away. Now, if you do hit on something that completely changes your franchise, that is helpful. It's not like that won't be helpful. But when you look at some of these teams that have the picks, you have a lot of the teams that are already good, right? And so you look at a team like the Ravens, they have 11 picks. Now, 8 of those are on day 3, but we know that the more lottery shots you have, the better your chance of actually hitting on some of those. And then in the aftermath, people are like, oh, look how well the Ravens draft. It's like, well, they had a lot of picks. And so if you have a lot of players you like there, I mean, you can get the type of profile you want. The Buffalo Bills have 10 picks, including 2 in round 2. The Kansas City Chiefs have 8 picks, but that includes 2 round 3 picks, right? So you're looking at these teams in some cases where they get compensatory picks, in some cases where they simply have been able to trade back, in part because the really good teams don't have such high priority picks in the first round that they feel like they have to take them. I mean, these more successful franchises actually have a little more flexibility sometimes, in part because those picks are worth less. So we do want to be well aware of the fact that when you're picking at the end of every round, that makes a big difference in terms of the overall value. But there's still something to be said for just having a lot of picks. The Eagles have 8 picks, including 4 in round 5. The Chiefs, for example, talk about drafting at the end of every round, but that second, third round pick that they got is from the Titans. That one ends up actually being at the very beginning of round 3. Not that different than the value of their round 2 pick. When you think about the things that you mentioned in terms of free agency and then where this draft is headed, it's not going to just magically happen that we get this reshuffling and we get the teams kind of meeting in the middle. If you are not currently a well-run or you haven't been well-run as a franchise, my thought would be we're going to see movement. We see movement every year. There are fun teams that do break out that sometimes it's not a matter of what they did this offseason, but what they did the previous 3 off seasons that is about to fully manifest. And I think that part of it is a lot of fun. But we do want to be careful just assuming that the NFL's method for rebalancing, which is that you have a salary cap. And so teams that don't have to re-sign as many stars should have more money, but can you spend it as efficiently? We know you can't. Also with the draft here, we're saying, yeah, you're going to be able to make some QB picks up top. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of good QBs in this draft if that's what you need. But then just in terms of the total number of picks, in many cases, it is those already good teams that have a mild advantage.
They definitely do. And this is a really fascinating conversation because what we're talking about is just like the overall macro environment for team building. One of the things we've talked about in past years when we've had these offseason conversations, Shawn, is that rookie QB contract window, which was a huge thing. But almost as quickly as that was the biggest deal in football, we get this lesson that football's constantly evolving as a sport. There's so many dimensions to football, so many variables, so many things that lean into why things work or don't work. The rookie QB contract thing was relative to a somewhat constraining salary cap. Now that the salary cap has exploded, it definitely changes the math. And even as teams are paying quarterbacks a lot more, they're able to do it when you're paying them a lot more. They're able to do it in ways that when they extend these guys, they're changing the cap number for the early parts of that contract, and then they're exploding it in the later parts. But then the salary cap has exploded again by the time the later part comes, and then they restructure again, and they never really actually – they're pushing off a lot into the future. Those bills do come due eventually. We've seen that with like the Saints, right? But if you're only doing that at quarterback, and if the cap continues to just explode, which by all projections, it's just going to continue. I mentioned to you, I think off the air, but I saw something a few weeks back, a month, maybe 2 months back, that was talking about by like 2030, it's where it's going to be. And it's just, the projections just continue to be really aggressive. I think 2030 is when the next like TV rights deal is, and where that will push things. It will push things even further is sort of the expectation. Everyone's getting theirs in the current landscape, but that also makes it easier to move money around and to do different things. And so that makes it tougher. I mean, so like this is an off season for us, Shawn, where, I talked about Washington early in the off season, and I'm still really excited about them. And they went out and did some of the stuff that we thought was possible for them. They've made additions. They addressed some of the, Deebo Samuel is I think a very solid addition for them. And even though it wasn't necessarily a free agent addition, they got it through cheap trade capital. And then basically because they were then able to pay him what the Niners were not able to pay him. Right. And he's going to be an interesting piece if he's able to get back physically to what he's been at his peak, an interesting piece in an RPO heavy offense and catch and run and all of that stuff. Well, I mean, they're out going and doing that stuff. They've made other additions as well that are not immediately coming to my mind, but they traded for Laramie Tunsil, right? They have a new left tackle, right? They went out and did that. They have a lot of cap space to bring on big contracts that other teams need to shed to have some, because not every team has, just because the cap is rising doesn't mean like when you have a 53-man roster, doesn't mean that every team can just take on all the salary and pay all the players what they're worth. The Niners are the best example of that. They had to let a lot of guys go this offseason. They just had too many players that they are trying to pay or want to pay or what have you. And there's other teams that just didn't address needs in free agency and things because their own liabilities are very high. The Saints always come up. They always are mortgaging future years, and they're going to be over the cap in future years. And then, okay, the cap rises a ton. Okay, we're not over the cap as much as we thought we were going to be, but we still don't have flexibility, right? We still have to do all these restructurings and things just to get to where we're able to do different things. But I just think this is a fascinating discussion because as you were talking about it, I was thinking about Washington. I was thinking about New England, who we have a couple teams here that 5 years ago would have had a great advantage, that they would have had a year one quarterback who played as well as they did. And now he's on a rookie contract for 3 more years. And you have this incredible window. Really, I say 5 years ago, it's probably more like 10 years ago. The model I always think about for this is the Russell Wilson Seahawks model, where when he was still on his rookie contract and they had some other key players on rookie contracts, they hit on Richard Sherman, they hit on like Bobby Wagner and a couple like key guys before any of those guys had to be paid. Earl Thomas was on his rookie contract. When they won their Super Bowl, they had so much surplus value out of rookie contracts, significant at the quarterback position, also some key defensive players. And they were able to just like add around that in free agency the way that when the cap was a little bit more constraining, not every team was able to, but they brought in Michael Bennett, great on the defensive line as a free agent. They brought in Cliff Averill. They brought in, all these different guys. Some of the stuff they brought in didn't work. Percy Harvin and then eventually Jimmy Graham, and some of those things they tried to do on the offensive side was not actually helpful. They gave up a lot of resources and paid a lot of money. But the point was the advantage that provided. And for a long time, it was the case that you could only play in a Super Bowl if you had a quarterback on a rookie contract or you had Tom Brady, basically was what it was. And then now it's become like Patrick Mahomes more recently. Anyway, that doesn't appear to be what's going to be the case in the future. We're talking about a different thing now. And so I'm just explaining, I guess, that the model has shifted to some degree. And I think that's really fascinating is what I was thinking about as you were talking about that. But Shawn, let's talk about these actual odds, these teams, these things that we see as we're looking at them. I want to start in the NFC North right away, because this is the division that probably is the best division in the NFL going into next year. Detroit is favored. They're at plus 135. Green Bay's at plus 275. Minnesota's at plus 400. Chicago's at plus 425. What I can say is no other last place odds in divisional odds in the entire NFL is shorter than plus 600. And that even is in, relative to some of these divisions that are weak, right? Where it's like the top team isn't super strong. I mean, AFC South, Houston is plus 100. They're even money. And Houston's like, are they that sexy right now? Tampa in the NFC South, plus 110. They're the heavy favorite. Yeah, I mean, Tampa's good and all that. They lost Liam Cohen. Like, it's because the division's pretty weak. But even in those divisions, the last place team in both cases is 8-1, plus 800. You look at the NFC North, where every team is good. They're also like, we can't push the Bears down much further than this, right? There's a lot of reasons to like what the Bears have done this offseason. They addressed the lines big in pre-free agency, really. They traded for 2 guards, and then they signed a center. They made some moves on the defensive line. The Vikings the same. I think we talked about this on the last show. Maybe I wrote about it a little bit over at Stealing Signals. I did a whole piece on some of the biggest takeaways from free agency. I thought it was fascinating. Both the Vikings and the Bears really hammered the interior of the offense and defensive line, which to me was in relation to the Detroit Lions in a lot of ways, and what they were able to do on the offensive line. This is the best team in your division. You got to be able to combat that. You got to be able to combat that on the defensive line, and you want to have that offensive line. And obviously Ben Johnson left Detroit, goes to Chicago. He wants to build that same type of offense. And he also wants a defensive line that can compete with the team that just won the division, the team that he just left, the Detroit Lions. As I was going through this, typing in these odds a little bit, I mentioned to you, I highlighted a couple that kind of stuck out to me. And then I see that I bolded them. You italicized a couple. It looks like you kind of like the Green Bay one. Maybe I'm speaking for you because we haven't talked about this at all. I had highlighted Minnesota at plus 400. I think they're going to be fascinating. I think the situation's really good for JJ McCarthy. I guess I'm not really buying Green Bay after a year where they just didn't really seem to throw as much as you'd like to see. I'm still a little bit questionable about their skill position group and where, that's going to go. There's a lot of people there that are like, they need a true number one. We all know, anyone who listens to Stealing Bananas knows that Shawn feels very highly about Jaden Reed. They already have their true number one. But Green Bay at plus 275 in this tough of a division is part of the reason I like Minnesota at plus 400. I think Minnesota did a better job on the lines and, in free agency and everything, and that Kevin O'Connell's a really good head coach, even though they have a rookie quarterback. They got great skill position talent. I think the Vikings are the biggest threat to the Lions, which they were last year, but I think they've gotten better this offseason. What do you think about Green Bay? And am I interpreting this right when you italicized in our little document here, Green Bay at 275, that you like their number as well as a potential, as maybe the best option to unseat the Lions?
Well, you think back to last season, and you grant the fact that these teams had to play each other. The Packers, despite in some ways being the most disappointing team in the entire NFL, this is a team that had a lot of interesting pieces on offense, that had Jordan Love coming off of just a massive breakout in the second half of 2023. You have a coaching staff that was able to get receivers just running wide open throughout the second half of that year. And then you actually watch them play. I think that the season was ruined for them when Love was injured in the first game. It changed everything that they wanted to do. Their receivers were not that healthy. We know that one of the big problems they have now, obviously, is that Christian Watson was injured in a serious way at the very end of the year, and so now they may be without him. But Jaden Reed also a number of ankle injuries that probably decreased their ability to do some of the things that they had intended. And then they made the point at multiple junctures late in the year that, we've got to get him more involved. We know that we need to do that. I think the only way that that happens is that if you sort of lose track of it because he's not at full strength at different times when you're doing the play calling, you get in these ruts. Big picture, they ended up letting this offense be just handing the ball to Josh Jacobs, which is utterly gross. Right now, Josh Jacobs, a lot better than, say, what the Chiefs are doing with Kareem Hunt, who somehow has been re-signed by Kansas City. But it's a really low upside approach to the season, and yet they still ended the year with the third best net points in the NFC, right? Trailing only the Lions and the Eagles. If you have a healthy season from Jordan Love next year, you have that coaching staff. I don't know. Partly, I guess I assume that they will take the lesson of this year, which is that they underperformed in a wide variety of ways because they didn't have that explosive passing dynamic. This is a team top to bottom I think is extremely talented. You have a QB, you have a coaching staff. I think they will fix those problems. And if you just have a healthy QB starting from where they're already at. Now, again, I think that the Vikings are going to be a problem. You would assume that the Bears are going to be dramatically better. The takeaways for me would be that even though I think the Lions were the best team in football overall last year, it's just going to be tough. And so even there are odds are a little bit tricky when you just look at the whole picture, right? They have the coordinators departing. That may or may not be a big deal. I think that generally when you're evaluating these teams, you want to be looking at the overall talent and you want to be looking at the head coach. That's the guy who sets the tone for everything that happens. And I do think that you have a sort of night and day difference there between Dan Campbell and the leadership for the Eagles. But when we think about what the Eagles did, where they have this super team, they lose their coordinators, they completely fall apart in 2023, and then they come back with better coordinators again in 2024, and they go and they win the Super Bowl. And by the end of the season, they look like far and away the best team in football. You don't know exactly what points in time for the Lions that maybe they might run into those same problems, or simply that they have got new coordinators in place who will allow them to do what the Eagles did this past year. There is some reason for some concern, but I think the biggest problem the Lions have is simply that, as you mentioned, the NFC North is going to be that good.
It's going to be good. The Bears are not also rans here either. I do think Ben Johnson, and they still have Ryan Pace in place, but just look at their moves. It's clear that Ben Johnson's fingerprints were on them with the really aggressive offensive line maneuvers and what obviously they had in Detroit that he built everything sort of off of and being able to win up front. That's really interesting stuff. With the Packers, do you think, as we're kind of talking about, you're talking about injuries, it made me think of Marshawn Lloyd. Do you think Marshawn Lloyd is still intriguing, or what do we think about him going into year two? I mean, he's obviously a prospect we really like.
I think so, and yet you did get more of the same from him. When you think about the guys who were the most compelling sleeper-ish picks at running back, really from the perspective of both Lloyd and then Jalen Wright with the Dolphins, we got some reason to believe that their college teams had not used them more for reasons that were real, right? And one of the things I think is interesting with Wright is that his college teammate, Dylan Sampson, buried a little bit in just how deep this draft is going to be or is at running back. And yet the numbers would bear out the idea that he's actually significantly better than Wright. So when we look through a couple of seasons, and you have the unfortunate element there where the Dolphins have made it confusing, at least for fantasy managers, or scary when you're thinking about someone like Alexander Mattison, who probably shouldn't be on an NFL roster. But if there's one where it creates trouble for you in fantasy football, it would be Miami. I think that we're getting signs from both teams that those are not really the guys that you want to bet on.
That makes sense. Yeah, I just remember how much their coaching staff was talking him up in the post-draft period and really felt like he was going to provide an explosive element to their backfield and all of these things that Josh Jacobs didn't really actually ever provide. And we'll see. They may address the position again in the draft and try to find that element again, but he was never.
And I do think it's interesting when you mention, or we talk about how the draft is so balanced, right? With first round picks, but also total number of picks. You do have a few teams like I mentioned the Vikings earlier. The Commanders would also kind of be in that position where their total number of picks are limited enough that they're probably less likely to hit on a running back. But when you think about, say, 28, 29 teams and the depth that they have on day 3, it'll be interesting to see how that really comes to fruition within the draft itself. You're not going to be fighting a handful of other teams for those running backs. You're going to be fighting everybody. There are a lot of them, but it's also something where you're going to have to fend off not just a handful of teams that maybe have a lot of picks late. A team like the Jets, who somehow feels like their approach is, let's go get both Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis. You're going to have to fend off everybody.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. There's a lot of teams that are just always adding at that position. And what we saw last year, I mean, it was later in the draft than what will be anticipated, I think, this year. But once teams sort of started breaking that seal, and I want to say it was the late 4th round through the late 5th round, a ton of running backs went. They were going we talk about draft capital a ton. It was where Isaiah Davis went and where Braylon Allen went. And so many of the other running backs had like draft capital that was like, they were basically identical where they were all going there's a 10 or 15 pick span there in last year's draft where I think like six or 7 backs went in like 10 or 15 picks. I mean, there was just a ton once teams started hitting that. So I do think that, we may see something similar this year where teams are going to say, well, okay, we don't want to spend really high draft capital at running back. It's a deep group. We know that we can get a good option later. But once you start to see a few of these guys come off, it almost feels like a fantasy draft a little bit where you get a little run where these teams are going, hey, I really wanted to get a running back in this class, and a couple of the guys I like are now gone. And is this the point where we like, what would we pay for running backs these days? We don't pay first round picks, but I don't know how long I can wait,
And there are just so many good ones. So I'm fired up about that. When I did the 4-round mock up on RotoViz, and a lot of those guys are running backs. And at a certain point, you feel like you run out, and then you're like, well, these 3 other ones, would have been late round 3 picks in a previous draft, and projecting them to be round 6 or 7 maybe in reality, but still very viable sleepers right away. Then what's the next division that you have here as being the most interesting with these odds?
I mean, I think we both highlighted something in the NFC West, so I want to jump over there. In part, I think this is interesting because the Niners are the favorites at plus 125, which isn't overwhelming. There are some favorites that are in minus money, right? Like the Bills are minus 270. You'd have to lay down, significantly more at risk to win $1 relative to obviously the other teams in their division. The Chiefs are below even odds. They're in minus money. The Ravens are. The Eagles are. So half the divisions in the league have a favorite that is in, a clear favorite. In this case, the Niners are the favorite at plus 125. They're not being viewed as a clear favorite, which I think is fascinating. The second team here is the Rams at plus 185. And as you were talking about the point differential for the Packers being third best in the NFC, that was something that had slipped my mind a little bit. They came in just ahead of the Bucs, ahead of the Vikings, and ahead of the Commanders. Who were all between plus 90 to backers were at plus 122. So that range. And then there's this huge gap. Arizona was actually next at plus 21. So much closer to just like average teams, but there was like 6 teams in the NFC that had really good plus minus. I bring this up because the Rams, I noticed, were minus 19 as a division winner at 10-7. And halfway through the year, there was all this talk that they're going to trade Matthew Stafford in season. They're going to trade Cooper Kupp. And then as the offseason started, there was all this talk that they're going to trade Matthew Stafford. He's going to go somewhere else, and maybe they'll bring in Aaron Rodgers. Who knows? We know that they've hit on some important young players. Puka Nacua is a huge one. Jared Verse on the defensive line. I'm sure there's other players that I don't know a ton about. But we also know that go back to like 4 years ago when they won the Super Bowl, they were mortgaging the future by trading away a lot of future first-round picks to get guys like Jalen Ramsey and all this stuff. And then Aaron Donald retires, and they don't have as much of the star talent other than some of these young studs that they've been able to hit on. They don't have as much of the veteran star talent, and they draft really well. And they get a lot of credit for being very analytically strong, but there's multiple drafts there in like 2022, 2023, maybe. I don't know exactly the years, so don't quote me on that. But they didn't have like a first round pick. They didn't have a couple other options later. They had like 5 picks overall. I guess I'm fascinated that they have such strong odds right now. I guess I didn't think their roster was this deep, that they would be at plus 185 here. And then you have both Seattle and the Cardinals at plus 600. You highlighted the Cardinals on their plus 600, which I get highlighting specifically them, because to me, the Rams at plus 185 seems odd. I highlighted the Niners at plus 125 because it seems odd to me you're getting plus money on the Niners, because I don't think the Rams are like actually that good. I do know the Niners gave up a ton of talent. They're going to be worse. They also were really unhealthy last year, and I think they're going to get more play out of guys. And they saw development out of guys like Jawan Jennings, who looks like he's going to be an actual, like, okay, yeah, you lose Deebo Samuel, but you have a really good. This is why I haven't been necessarily as high on Ricky Pearsall's, like, oh, he's going to step into the Deebo Samuel stuff, his opportunity in front of him, because I'm looking at it like, well, if Christian McCaffrey is able to play, and we've seen older backs be able to play, I think a lot of people are assuming that he's just never going to play again. Maybe he won't. I don't know. The Achilles tendonitis is scary, right? That could flare back up. He could tear his Achilles. But if he's in there, he's going to be used a lot. We saw them use him heavily immediately when they did get him out there this year, and then he got a knee bruise. And I think that knee bruise was probably not quite as serious as ending his whole season, but their season was over by the time he would have been able to come back. So he ends up missing the rest of the year. The last time we saw McCaffrey have a year like that with the Panthers, he came back. Now, this was when he was a lot younger, but he came back the next year and was, I'm pretty sure, able to stay very healthy and play and get a lot of touches and a lot of work. Part of my mindset is like, well, Christian McCaffrey got a lot of rest last year is sort of where I'm at. Like, if he's got one more good year in him, and I'm maybe not willing to admit that he doesn't, he's going to be a significant part of this offense. You have George Kittle. You have Brandon Ayuk coming back. He's going to be still rehabbing the ACL in the early part of the year. You have Jawan Jennings, who looked like a legit number 1 at times last year. His numbers, if you go dig into the per route stuff as well, targets per out, run yards per out, it's all very strong. It's way stronger than what Ricky Pearsall put out there as a rookie. Like, that's a team where I think they still have a lot of depth. You still have Kyle Shanahan. If they're able to bounce back a little bit this year, the West is an interesting division for a number of reasons. One of the big ones being, I'm pretty sure they play both the AFC and NFC South, which are really weak divisions. These teams have easy schedules because of the way that the schedule aligns. I don't think we've talked about this, I think, on a past show. I don't think the Seahawks offseason has gone as well as, I just don't think it's gone well at all. I think it's I want to hear what you have to say about the Cardinals. I think it's fascinating you highlighting the Cardinals here, and I could definitely see that because the Niners are old. I'm kind of defending this idea that, because I'm right there with you, that the Rams probably are not the bet at 185. The Seahawks at 6-1 are not even a very good long shot bet. And then I assume when you're thinking about the Cardinals that the Niners, this is an old team that has lost a lot of talent and is probably pretty fragile, and you could see this team collapse. So I can see why this is a division where you might like this long shot option, the Cardinals, if they're able to do something. I'm curious your thoughts on them. But to me, I also see this as like, man, the Niners should be bigger favorites. They had a tough year last year, but they had a lot of talent. They've been very good for a handful of years. Kyle Shanahan's a good coach. There's a lot of reasons to believe that they're going to, in a healthier season, bounce back and have a good year this year. I think they're a fun bet to be like a surprising one of the best teams in the NFC, for example. I mean, you go over to the Super Bowl odds, they're 19-1. I think it's a great bet. There's not a lot of times you get a team that was in the NFC Championship just a couple years ago, and then they have an injury-plagued season. They were in the Super Bowl a couple years ago, and then they have an injury-plagued season, and now they're suddenly viewed as if everyone in the NFC has sort of passed them by. Maybe I'm overstating the effects of 2024, or I'm understating the effects of 2024. I'm overstating their ability to bounce back from that. Maybe it was more significant than I'm letting on, but the NFC West is fascinating. What do you think about the Cardinals?
Well, just to very quickly build off of your notes there on the Rams and the 49ers, we have the Rams, I think, as such an enthusiastic pick because they had so many hits in last year's draft. And so you're talking about a team that has that second year, secondary breakout if the guys are already playing well, where now maybe you have young stars across the board. But there is this big contrast, which you alluded to, in terms of what they can do from this point in the offseason forward. The Rams, because they did well from a win-loss perspective, despite being minus in net points last year, they had the 26th pick, right? And then they did trade their second round pick. And so you only have that one relatively early-ish pick, whereas the 49ers, who lost a ton, they still do have that element where they were able to move some of these things into some draft value, right? So they have 11 picks in this draft because they had the bad season, right? They have earlier picks than they usually do. So when you think about those early picks, you're talking about 11, 43, 75. That's 10 or more picks up in each of those rounds than they would normally be. And then they have the 2 round 3s, the 2 round 4s, the 2 round 5s, even they have 3 round 7s. Even with having to forfeit one of their round 5 picks, they have so many ways to attack this draft, get deeper, get better. And they're starting from, as you mentioned, probably a higher point than maybe people are giving them credit for. But I think both of these teams probably are a little more flawed than the perception. And not that we want to just purely look at last year's points and say, well, that tells you where they are. But it is odd to think about the Cardinals as being the team that had the best point differential last year in this division. And the Cardinals blew a lot of games that they could potentially win. Now, I'm not necessarily saying I think they're going to win the division. I do think that the odds probably don't reflect where they are compared to the other teams. They probably are well ahead of the Seahawks, even though this is a team the Seahawks are a lot of fun. I hope that it works out for them, even though I'm scared for them. But even if you are not a believer in Kyler Murray, which I've said for years that I'm not, even if you were skeptical that Marvin Harrison was going to go out there and really blow up, which I was, and then which he didn't, right? You're still starting from a point where if Kyler Murray plays okay, then you're talking about this being a 500 team really just as the starting point. And it does give you some room to outperform where you think, well, what if Marvin Harrison does take a little bit of a step, right? If they get that second year jump from him, then you're starting to talk about this being a very dynamic offense. Even if Murray has all of these weaknesses, because he's a hybrid QB, you have Harrison, and then Trey McBride is actually kind of moving into unstoppable force territory. As that, we hear a lot about the Joker. I'm excited to see what the Broncos might do with Evan Ingram. But, Trey McBride just completely changes a football game. And you add that to the Cardinals being one of the most dynamic run scheme teams in the NFL, both probably because of Murray, but also because of some other things that they do. This could be a team that is very dynamic on offense, and then they have made they've made 3 meaningful acquisitions on defense and free agency. They've lost basically nothing, right? From that perspective, it just seems like the Cardinals are a very good bet to outperform what the consensus seems to be on them.
I like that take. I want to circle back to the Rams, who I was talking about their draft history and saying, don't quote me on that. They didn't have a first round pick from like 2018 through all the way up until I think last year for like 5 or 6 straight years. But they still did get depth. I made a comment there that they didn't have a lot of picks, but most of those years were able to get some extra day 3 picks and do some different things. 2017, they also didn't have a round 1 pick. I'm still working back trying to figure out when the last time they took a round 1 pick was. It was Jared Goff in 2016 up until I think last year. So yeah, I mean, they did have that long run of not taking a first round pick, but they were able to make other selections. I think one of those years they traded back into day 3 a couple of times to just get some extra like 7th round picks, one of the thinnest of those years. But as you noted, they've hit on a lot of different stuff. Maybe the Rams are better than I realized. I like your notes on the Cardinals. That's an interesting division for sure. It's in flux. Going into last year, the Niners were expected to be one of the very best teams in the NFC. It's seemingly not that way anymore. I mean, they still have the 4th best like Super Bowl odds out of the NFC. So it's not that they're very, very far down. The Eagles would be first there, then the Lions. The Commanders are actually 3rd on that list. But then the Rams are the 5th best. They're right there tied with the Packers. You get the Vikings not far behind. And then you get the first NFC South team, the Bucks. So you see that the NFC West isn't looked at as being weak necessarily relative to a division like the NFC South. You mentioned in the AFC West, or you noted here in our notes. I didn't highlight anything there, but I want to go to the AFC West because I think it's an interesting division as well, where I've been trying to figure it out. I think the Chargers are a reasonable bet, but I also thought if they could have got a really dynamic running back, that would have been pretty huge. And then they went and got Najee Harris, and I'm just like, man, they're going to give him way too many touches this year, regardless of whatever number he gets. I was hoping they would just go after a rookie and really, have somebody that would be exciting behind that offensive line. And then you have Justin Herbert, you have Lad McConkey, you have these other things going for you. Probably will still do that. They only signed Najee to what's essentially a 1-year deal. And I think they'll probably still take a rookie in this really deep class and then be hoping that is their guy in 2026 and beyond. But they're at plus 275. Part of the reason I am not entirely sure on the Chargers is we believe in the Broncos around here. We believe in Bo Nix and what they've been able to do. You mentioned, or you italicized them in our document. I keep acting like you've said something about them, but no, you highlighted them here. The Chiefs are the favorites at minus 125. Obviously, Andy Reid, Patrick Mahomes, all of those things. Their season didn't end well in the Super Bowl, but still a very dominant team. Can anyone really threaten the Chiefs? That's the other big part of the question. It's tricky when you have multiple teams that are kind of interesting. I mean, even the Raiders got Geno Smith. They have a long way to go, but like they're probably going to be better than last year when they were throwing out the quarterbacks they're throwing out. Desmond Ritter's playing and stuff. 20-1. That's just to win the division. It's like you have no chance, is what the odds are saying. They're saying the Chiefs are really strong favorites, but also the Chargers and Broncos are really strong number 2 and number 3 teams. So we're not even taking you seriously as this 4th team. There's only 2 teams in the entire NFL that have longer odds to win their divisions, the Browns and the Giants. For the record, the Raiders' Super Bowl odds are 7th lowest. There are 6 teams that have lower Super Bowl odds, but there's only 2 teams that have lower division odds. Again, I think that speaks to the fact that the Chargers, Broncos are viewed as up-and-coming second options in a division that also has a really interesting top team, and the Chiefs, obviously. This is a fascinating division. What do you think about the Broncos?
I mean, to me, the Broncos seem like the next team to join the superpowers in the AFC. We talked a bit at the end of the season about how Bo Nix probably is a more interesting player and has a higher ceiling even than the rookie results would indicate. Now, I think that he's still a wide range of outcomes play, right? The narrative or the belief about Nix has changed a lot. You can see that in dynasty startups. You can see that in where he is going in best ball. I guess I think that he's still got a lower floor, or there's risk of a failure to develop, and that the Broncos fall back. And yet at the same time, one of the things that we were getting to see a little bit more in stretches at the end was how they could use his legs along with the deep passing options. They did get embarrassed in the playoffs, but they did hit on that long pass to Troy Franklin to start the game. We know that Franklin had a bunch of missed opportunities during the season. He was a little bit like the Broncos version of Xavier Worthy, where he didn't have the additional targets to round out the profile, but it would have meant something for Knicks if they hit on some of those plays. You look at what they did in free agency, and they spend big to add a safety, to add Greenlaw there at linebacker. Their defense was also embarrassed in the playoff game, and yet through the course of the season, their defense was one of the best in all of football. You add a couple of players here, they lose relatively little in free agency. So this is a team where you look at the pluses and minuses, and you're like, this is a team that got probably considerably better. And maybe it's just the name, maybe it's hanging on to that season from 2023 a little bit too much. But I do think that Evan Ingram is a potential real difference maker. You look at what Knicks did last year, and I think it's not just Knicks. And one of the things, when you look at the Chargers odds, very clearly people are just betting on Harbaugh. And that's probably not wrong. And yet I do think that his performance at the NFL level is maybe a tiny bit overstated. The other thing there, obviously, is Justin Herbert. And we got some dynamic performances from him, and we had some explosive games from Ladd McConkey, but they seem farther away from building out their total offense than the Broncos are. One of the things with the Broncos and the Chargers is that, Sean Payton has been able to be there longer than Jim Harbaugh. And so even though the Chargers probably started from a higher point, they are probably, it probably sounds weird to say they're a half year behind, but I guess I would still say that I think they're behind overall from a total roster building perspective, to the point where you've got to be very high on Herbert and you've got to be relatively low on Knicks to have the Chargers ahead of the Broncos going into this next season. And I think that it does wrap back into your point, where one of the things that helped the Chargers last year at times was that their running back position was so bad that they couldn't really run the type of offense they would probably prefer. The running backs being better for them in 2025, if the better comes in the version of a Najee Harris, that could actually be bad for them, as opposed to just having to rely on the arm, which, maybe the golden arm of Justin Herbert. He's actually someone who's a wider range of outcomes player too, still even this deep into his career. We still don't know if he's going to be a Hall of Famer or if he's going to be merely good. And that obviously makes a huge difference for where the Chargers end up. I guess I just really like this Broncos roster top to bottom. If you think that Ingram does allow them to do some things, if you assume that some of those young receivers take a step forward, and then they add one of these star running backs in the draft, which it seems like they probably will, I'd be really concerned. I'm wearing my Super Bowl Chiefs hat here. Both the Chargers and the Broncos create problems for them. But the Broncos, I think, create huge problems. And we even saw that with, they obviously tanked the last game, but they just lucked out in the first game to be able to get past the Broncos already last year. I think we're moving back into that time frame where the Broncos are a power team in the AFC West, and this Chiefs-Broncos rivalry becomes one of the best in all of football.
That's a fun one. I don't know enough about the offensive line stuff, but as you were talking about the Chargers, one thing I do want to say from my perspective that I've had optimism on them about is that they do have, everything that has been positive about Rashawn Slater, who was our 2021 first round pick. That's been hurt a lot. When he's healthy, though, that he's essentially one of the best tackles in the league. Then they went and got Joe Alt in the top 10 in 2024. He's played 2 seasons They have a first-round left guard. They signed Mekhi Becton from the Eagles this offseason to be their right guard. And the running stuff, I mean, the Najee Harris stuff I'm with. If their improvement at the running back is to give the ball to Najee Harris a ton, that's probably not great. Dobbins still not signed, right? I haven't seen anything there. I mean, I guess I'm kind of hoping he winds up back there and they wind up with a rookie and maybe we don't get a ton of Najee Harris or something. But the reason that I'm more optimistic than you on the Chargers is on that offensive line. And it's on the fact that a lot of these teams with the lighter defenses were able to build these run first offenses that were pretty successful over the last year. If the Harbaugh wants to run a ton thing is actually effective, right? And they're able to throw off that a little bit. But no, I hear your point. And I hear your point that maybe they could end up running a little bit too much and it could limit what they're able to do. Some very positive notes on the Broncos there. I think this is one we're going to disagree on, though. I think I'm Team Chargers over the Broncos. I have some bigger concerns than you about the skill position group at the Bronco or with the Broncos. Probably bigger concerns than you about Sean Payton generally, who I've always really liked, but the lack of the running back passing and all of that stuff last year, I don't know. A lot of the stuff last year to me felt like he was still, I think, struggling to modernize what he did so well 15 years ago. Because again, the league is always constantly evolving. What his offenses were with Drew Brees were incredible. What they need to be in 2025 with the Broncos are probably slightly different. Maybe he sees something with Evan Ingram and everything that I don't necessarily see, but I thought a lot of what they tried to do last year and even the personnel they were acquiring and a lot of that, you wind up with Marvin Mims in the backfield a bunch of the season and all of these different things you're trying to do, I thought was frankly,
I think I'm pretty excited about Mims in the backfield.
No, I mean, that's fun, but it was more of we couldn't get anything else out of the running backs. They continued to use Javonte Williams like crazy all year. They would get a little bit of positive momentum out of like Jaleel McLaughlin, and then they put him back onto the bench the next week. His usage was so weird after a good 2024, and they needed dynamism out of the backfield. You want to talk about a team overusing a plotting running back, like that might be the concern for Najee Harris next year. I mean, hopefully they go get a dynamic back as well. They don't have Javonte Williams anymore, but what Peyton was willing to do last year, because Williams apparently filled what he needed out of the position. It's like, man, don't you realize you have to have more dynamism back there than what you have? I just thought it handicapped their offense a little bit at times.
Well, we know that some of this came from infinite pick sixes against Jameis Winston and the Browns, but they outscored the Chiefs. They outscored the Chargers last year. They did that despite a complete lack of the running game. They're interesting. When you went through some of the notes on the Chargers offensive line, the Broncos put up some interesting numbers last year, and then SIS has them as the number 2 pass blocking unit in terms of points earned. That's certainly one of the reasons that Bo Nix was able to be successful despite not having a running game and despite not having – I mean, they had pretty clearly last year below average passing weapons and yet scored well. They had one of the weaker run blocking units in terms of the grades. Sometimes that's the way an offensive line will profile. When you added really poor running backs behind a poor run blocking unit, it did incentivize the pass. And it's one of those things where incentivizing the pass in most cases is good. And so we'll see what they're able to come back with. If they come back with more running plays in 2025, it better be because they have a better running back.
Yeah. I think their line's really good as well. I think that's a good point. But you just said that their skill position, like their receiving talent, was definitely underwhelming. And what they've added is Evan Ingram and Trent Sherfield. You seem to be very excited about Evan Ingram.
I like Evan Ingram. To be clear, I don't think it's going to be some big fantasy win. I do think it's a great fit for this offense, especially if they end up with one more meaningful player, which hopefully, I mean, as fantasy analysts, it's hard for us not to think that what most teams should do in the draft is take a wide receiver in the first round and a running back in the second round. So we'll see if they're able to add some meaningful pieces at those positions.
That on Evan Ingram maybe not being as much of a fantasy hit is a really interesting one too, and might be part of why I'm like struggling to see it with the Broncos, because Peyton and the way he runs his offense is so much less fun for fantasy than the way that they're able to actually win games at times. And they've been pretty successful the last couple of years. Maybe that's seeping in a little bit as I talk about like not liking their skill position and the Marvin Mims usage and all this stuff. It's just that like it's one of those things that even if the Broncos are really good, is it going to pay off that much for fantasy with, especially with the secondary pieces? It's tricky. We'll see how that all plays out.